Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for our Bible study. We're continuing our study of the book of Proverbs, and we're in Proverb 21:13 today, talking a little bit about how important it is for us to consider whom? The poor, right? It's important for us to be aware and paying attention to the needs of the poor in our daily lives. Before we get into this discussion, though, tonight, if you would, let's bow our heads together, share in a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, thank you for the day that you've given us, the opportunity to study your word tonight, to gain your precepts and an understanding of your testimony. Give us, as we have been requesting throughout this study, the wisdom to use this knowledge that you provide for us, and give us a heart that wants to help others and to be productive in our efforts to encourage and uplift others who may have need. Father, strengthen us in our service to you. Help us to honor you every step of our lives, and we pray all these things through thy Son's name. Amen. So let's talk a little bit about this tonight, this idea of whoever shuts his ears to the poor will cry and not be heard. That's pretty sobering, actually, right? It reminded me a little bit, and I didn't put it in the notes, but it reminded me a little bit of what Jesus says about seeking forgiveness of sins in his prayer. Remember, he said, forgive us our sins as what? As we forgive, right? When we request the forgiveness that comes from God, we need to pause and consider the fact that we're going to receive from God the same manner of forgiveness that we extend. And that's a sobering thought as well. And this one kind of fit that kind of description for me in our study, that here's this mindset that, Lord, help me listen to the cries and the pleas of those who have need, so that I'll be heard when I have need and when I need help and when I need to be encouraged, and in particular when those needs may come from or need to come from God himself. Here's the whole text in the King James Version. Whoso stoppeth his ears at the cry of the poor, he also shall cry himself and shall not be heard. And I think, and that's really twofold, by the way. I think in some ways it's probably a reality that generally speaking, if I've ignored the opportunities to help others, then it may very well come to a point where when I'm the one crying out, no one's going to pay attention. And in particular, God is trying to encourage us to appreciate how or why should He be responsive to us when we have had opportunities to assist and aid and step into those responsibilities and have done nothing to help and encourage that. And so that's our discussion tonight. The first question that we asked in relationship to this study was simply this: what happens to those who do not pay attention? And I do this every time we do this class. I always answer the first question before I give you the first question. But anyway, what happens to those who do not pay attention to the cries for help from others? Yeah, he doesn't gain the benefit of being heard. If he closes his ears to others, he'll lose the benefit of being heard when his cries go out. So let's turn our attention here for a few minutes to Luke chapter 16. And that was the next question that kind of leads us into our discussion of this proverb this evening. And we asked this question out of this account of the rich man, right? What could wealth not prevent? What actions while living would have aided the rich man in his eternal state? Now, it's somewhat coincidental that our Sunday evening studies the last few weeks have been about life after death, right? And what happens. And we've come into Luke chapter 16, both of those sermons. And now here we are again tonight in this study back into that narrative. But I want us to appreciate that what could his wealth not do for him? Right. It wasn't. You've heard me say this before. Death is the great equalizer, right? Death befalls everybody, wealthy, poor, middle of the ground, whatever. Death is the great equalizer in that sense. Everybody ultimately will face an end. And for this man, this rich man described there in Luke chapter 16, he had everything and anything, right? He had all kinds of benefits and things that aided him, but yet here was a poor beggar who he ignored, and seemingly all the time. And here's what happens, verse 22 of Luke chapter 16. And it came to pass that the beggar died and was carried by the angels into Abraham's bosom. The rich man also died and was buried. And in hell he lift up his eyes, being in torments, and seeth Abraham afar off, and Lazarus in his bosom. It's kind of interesting to me that here's this moment in time where here's this poor man, and how's it described that he's received in this moment where he leaves this world to the next? What's the text tell us happens to him? Yeah, right. So the poor man, the beggar here, he's received by the angels, and you see this kind of very comforting scene that unfolds for him. What's interesting to me is, what's the rich man? He was what? He's buried. He's buried. No. All the things all the comforts and ease and peacefulness that he experienced in his earthly life, gone how quickly? Now, just gone, right? And buried, and he lifts up his eyes being in torment. The implication of that account, and again we've discussed in our Sunday night studies a couple of different times, whether it be parable or reality, that's not really our topic tonight because the imagery is. But here's this man who had every opportunity. You could see this poor man being set at the rich man's gate day after day after day and being ignored. He would have embraced what from that rich man? The text tells us. Yeah, the scraps, the crumbs. The crumbs that would fall off the rich man's table, this poor beggar would have received and found that to be beneficial to himself. That's how poor he is. He's so destitute that what do the dogs do? The dogs come and lick his wounds, right? And lick his sores, the text says. This is a man completely destitute, and would it have taken the rich man any level of discernment to know this man was destitute? And I'm not tricking you there. No. Right. And to just see what was happening to the man would have clearly told you this man has need. This man is legitimately in need. He can't even get to the gate on his own. He's carried there. And while he's left there to lay, the dogs come. Generally, if the dogs would come to us, we would do what with the dogs? We'd shoo them. He can't. That's how destitute he is. The dogs come and lick his wound. He can't even challenge that. And now he'd even received the crumbs and receives none. This is what he had been facing. And yet he's found in comfort and peace in the bosom of Abraham, the description just tells us. But the rich man who had had every opportunity to be of aid and assistance to this man neglected those opportunities. It's sobering to think how often he had an opportunity to do that. Go ahead, Bob.
Going back to 13th verse there, Proverbs. If you don't listen to the cry of the poor, then you won't be heard when you cry. Now, those who hear the wealthy person crying, is that people around him? Is that God, possibly in this lifetime, or is it God in the hereafter?
You mean who is the one that won't listen, that won't hear the cries?
Yeah, if you take the rich man and Lazarus, it's God in the hereafter that doesn't hear his cry.
Yeah, and I don't. And by using Luke 16, I'm not necessarily saying they're perfectly parallel.
Yeah.
To Proverbs 20, they're illustrative, not necessarily perfectly
one
parallel.
instance that answers that question, but
right.
Does that include all three situations? Or
yeah.
not?
Well, and I think probably because it's Proverbs, right? Because it's that kind of. The Proverbs generally deal with earthly life, right? They generally are addressing matters of how we should conduct and behave ourselves and things. If you do this, then this generally happens to you, or if you do that, then that generally. That's the Proverbs, right? That's kind of how they work. And so
they're sometimes called truisms.
Yeah.
They're not absolutes.
Yeah, and so I think when we think about that, what we can appreciate from it is that he's probably in the Proverb account addressing how others react to my cries. I've ignored people when they cried out for help. I should not expect people to come running to my aid when I cry out. That feels like what the Proverbs would be saying. Not necessarily, not just God. I think God's in that equation. I'm not saying He can't be in that equation, but because it's Proverbs, to me it's more like, how could any man expect others to come rushing to his aid when he's completely ignored everybody? And again, we're talking about, I keep using the word, we're talking about Proverbs here, right? The proverb isn't taking into account that I should help anybody no matter what they've done for me, right? That's not the point of the proverb. That's not its topic. Its topic is, if I've ignored opportunities to be helpful, then I shouldn't be shocked when the world ignores me when I'm crying out for help. That seems to be the message of the proverb. And then these other texts kind of help us backfill more information about the problems that creates.
And if you don't forgive your neighbor, then God's not going to forgive you.
Yeah.
So I think I'd have to take in both people around you and God, that proverb could be.
And I wouldn't argue that. I think you're right. I think you can see both of those imageries within the proverb. Good, Mike.
I've always imagined that the poor man was a righteous man, not somebody who would have taken crumbs of bread and sold them for drugs.
He doesn't talk, but I think it is an assumption you have to make about the beggar, right? If he was received into Abraham's bosom, this is somebody that God embraced as a righteous, good man to have brought him into that circumstance. Again, that's not necessarily what the text is trying to lead us to understand, but I think it can be understood within that narrative.
If you put these two individuals up somewhere and compare them to us today, we would have to fall under the rich man's guidance more than Lazarus. You know what I mean? So to what extent will we be held accountable? You know what I mean?
Yeah. And that's a great question. And if you couldn't hear what Kim was asking, the fact of the matter is, I'm not going to stand in judgment of everybody here, but generally speaking, we would fall on the side of things where we have more than enough on our table. We can put it that way. I think most of us can that's who we are. And so that kind of puts us on his side of the equation. And I think you have examples of folks who were generous, and we'll talk about some of that before we're done tonight, if we can get into Acts 4 before we're done this evening. But to what extent comes to the heart of the individual, right? And that's the hard part, because God doesn't. I don't know of any particular text that would give us some kind of mathematical, numerical way to say X amount of what you have should always be given to the poor. You've got the Old Testament examples of that 10%, right? That tithe. But that wasn't necessarily. That was very different, right? Because that was going where? That was going over to the priests, right? That was going to the priesthood and to take care of various things around the temple and those kinds of specific obligations. So it might be a help, but it's not necessarily a precise way to gauge. I think we just have to, for lack of a better word, be honest with ourselves. And when those opportunities present themselves, to make sure we're listening and reacting and responding to the best of our ability, and pray that God give us wisdom to be able to discern through those things. But it isn't easy. I admit to you, and I think you're probably feeling the same way about that, right? It isn't always easy to know how to handle, to what extent. But I think if we're just open and honest, and we lean towards generosity, I think I think we would be found in the favor of God, if that makes sense. Go ahead, Amy.
Think about it, there's a tremendous amount of arrogance on the rich man's part too. As soon as he lifts up his eyes and sees Lazarus over there, for him to even ask, for him to be able to get a drop of water on his tongue, that's arrogance.
Yeah. It is interesting to think about, and again, we're not able to dive all the way down these roads, but it is interesting, right? Because, and it's an aspect we don't always talk about when it comes to this account. You know, here was the rich man, and if I'm understanding the picture right, he's unwilling to even broom up the crumbs and take them out to the beggar. But when it came to his need, come cool my tongue with a drop of sin, Lazarus to cool my tongue with a drop of water. Now all of a sudden he wants the help, and Abraham says he can't hear you. And I know that's a paraphrase, but that's, in essence, it can't happen. And in that sense, it does fit what Proverb 21:13 is saying. You ignored this man that was outside your door all this time. Now you're asking him to bring a drop of water. Won't happen. Fix about what would have, could have, might have, right? We're given all that. And I'm sure he would have if that great gulf hadn't kept him from it. Any other thoughts or questions about that text? And we could have spent some time. I need to move forward a little bit, but it's interesting because, and let me just do this real quick with you. I didn't put it on the screen, but just if you've got your Bible in your hand, go back to the beginning of chapter 16. My own personal Bible study in more recent months, not that I didn't always try to do this, but I've been a lot more in tune with contextual thought in my personal study of the Scriptures. And I simply say that because what's interesting is the very first part of chapter 16 also deals with a rich man issue. But it's very different in that he talks about a man who was a steward of a rich man's financials, and that steward was going to get in trouble, and that's when he talks about going and he tells the guy, "What's your bill?" It was 80. No, now it's 50. and he talks about how if you can't be faithful with the righteous mammon, right? Then how can God give you even greater responsibilities? Now keep in mind, and again, I'm a little off the beaten path of Proverb 21:13, but I just want you to think a little bit about this. So in Luke chapter 15, I'm going to back you up one more chapter. In Luke chapter 15, he's addressing the scribes and the Pharisees, right? At the beginning of chapter 15. What three parables does he tell when he's dealing with those folks in chapter 15? Yeah, that's the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son, right? The prodigal. That's chapter 15. So Jesus has this conversation with his detractors, right? The Pharisees and those who had been following around as well. And he gives them this kind of lesson about, listen, I came to seek and save that which was lost. If you don't want to be found, I don't know how I'm going to change that. But he wants them to appreciate that that's his mission, right? There's this celebration when the lost coin is found, when the lost sheep is found, when the lost son returns. Then chapter 16, you can almost physically see him go, talking to the Pharisees, and then he turns. And the first verse of chapter 16 says, he also said to his disciples, had a conversation with his detractors, and tells them those three parables about the lost coin, sheep, and son. Then he turns his attention away from them and looks at his disciples and tells them this parable about how this man was shrewd in the ways of the world and how he was able to create friends by basically cheating on their bill. And Jesus isn't commending thievery. He's not commending dishonesty. What he's telling his disciples is, if you can't be wise with the earthly blessings that I provide for you, how can I entrust to you the keys to the kingdom? How can I entrust you with the stewardship and the responsibility of the weightier matters of bringing the gospel to the lost and dying world? What's your point, Brian? 5 minutes to get to this. If God can't rely on me to be able to see and hear the cries of somebody who needs my help and to step in and fulfill that, then how can He look at me as a responsible enough to handle the gospel message of Jesus? If I can't be responsible for the earthly things, that's the message of Luke chapter 16 in the first half. Before you ever get to then the conversation about the rich man and the beggar. The messaging initially is to His disciples, you've got to be good stewards. And you prove how you can be good stewards by handling the earthly things, the mammon of the world in wise ways. Then I can give you weightier responsibilities in order to take the gospel to the world. Then the Pharisees heard it, and the text says, who were covetous, and like that idea of having to be generous with the things of the world and be giving and caring. And then He comes and brings this account of the rich man and Lazarus to the Pharisees who'd overheard His conversation with the disciples. Friends, if we can't be reliable enough to help each other in simple earthly matters, then God looks at me and says, how can I entrust to you greater responsibilities of taking my message to that same world? If you walked by somebody in need every day, how can I trust you to also want to take my message to that same world? That seems to be the full picture after the accounts in Luke 15, then the record in Luke 16, the two different audiences that Jesus has conversations with, and then the ultimate conclusion at the end of chapter 16 about the rich man and the beggar. We need to accept this responsibility to listen and respond to those in need, because it has a bearing and an effect on our stewardship over greater important things like taking the gospel to the world. That's the big picture to me of particularly those two chapters in the book of Luke. Your thoughts? I'll pause. Let's go to the next question, lest we don't get any more than 3 in tonight. So what caution should be considered when doing charitable deeds, and what focus allows us to be generous with our earthly blessings? And I gave you 2 texts specifically to look at as it relates to that. The first is in the first part of Matthew chapter 6. Here's the text, and you can look at it in your own Bibles or it's on the screen for you. He said, "Take heed that you do not your alms before men to be seen of them, otherwise you have no reward of your Father which is in heaven. Therefore, when thou doest thine alms, do not sound a trumpet before thee, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may have glory of men. Verily I say unto you, they have their reward. But when thou doest alms, let not thy left hand know what thy right hand doeth, that thine alms may be in secret, and thy Father which seeth in secret Himself shall reward thee openly." So when we do our charitable deeds, when we reach out to be helpful to others, what should our mindset be? Yeah, I don't want to brag about it. I don't want to draw attention to it if I can help it. In other words, I don't have my alms, my gift in one hand and a trumpet making sure people draw their eyes towards me when I'm doing this. We can't. That always can't be avoided, by the way. You can't. There's a difference between being observed doing a kind act and purposely wanting to draw attention to yourself while you do a kind act, right? Those are 2 different things. I can remember when I was in Nashville, Tennessee, and I was a young preacher and was working with a congregation down there. I was doing 2 summer works with them. I can't even remember which summer it was that this happened. But anyway, came across a situation, wanted to help a guy get a meal, drove down to the McDonald's, took him, went in to buy him a meal, and I had forgotten that that there was a lady there that worked there that was a member of the congregation. I thought I had snuck in, snuck out, and trying just to do what was right. And as I'm leaving, I hear the man just vehemently thank me for the meal. And he kept saying, "Preacher, preacher." And of course, as I looked, here was her eyes. So then by Sunday, everybody knew that the preacher took you to McDonald's if you'd stop by and help you out, right? Right, and I'm just illustrating that to you. It happens. There are going to be moments where you're trying to do something nice for somebody, and somebody's going to notice it, and you can't help that. You weren't seeking that attention. You weren't looking for it. You weren't trying to blare your trumpet while you do your alms. That's not what I think Jesus is dealing with here in Matthew chapter 6. He's talking about particularly that Pharisee audience who wouldn't do anything if they didn't get credit for it, right? They didn't want to... And in fact, many of the things that they did do, they did only to get the credit for it. Had nothing to do with actually helping somebody. It was always about getting credit for it. Don't do your alms to be seen of men. Can't always be helped, but our efforts are to try to do them in such a way that as few number of people would even know that it ever happened. That's the first part of the question. The second half of the question asked about, let me go back to it real quick, what focus allows us to be generous with our earthly blessings? And we see that a little more at the latter part of that chapter. So what focus is it that allows us to do that? Yeah. Lay not up your treasures here in heaven, or here on earth, but lay up your treasures in heaven. My focus is on heavenly things. And I don't become consumed and enamored to an inordinate way towards the things of this world. And he reminds us that even the most precious things do what? In the very first part there in verse 19. Yeah, right? The moth can come in and eat the garment. The what seems like a precious metal can rust and corrupt. And it can even be what? Stolen, right? Thieves can break in and steal it. So don't focus on those things that fall prey to those problems. Lay up your treasures in heaven. Moth can't get to it. Rust can't get to it there. Thieves can't get to it there. And then he reminds us, verse 21, because where your heart is, or where your treasure is, I already answered for you. It's where your heart is, right? Where you lay your treasure, it's where your heart is. And if I find myself resistant to being charitable with my earthly blessings, it's probably an indicator that my heart is here rather than being in heaven where it needs to be. We've got to just make sure we keep a focus, and it'll help us in doing these things in the right way. And ultimately, if we're trying to serve this world and its things, what's verse 24 tell us? Yeah, you won't do it successfully, right? You can't serve two masters successfully. Your heart and mindset is going to be focused one way or the other. Again, there's no specific kind of text that tells us, how comfortable is too comfortable, right? Right? We're going to have to use some discernment and judgment about those kinds of things. The Apostle Paul even said about his own life, he said, I've learned to be content. I've learned to be abased. I've learned to abound, he said. I've learned in all things, no matter where I find myself in life. I've had moments of great comfort, and I've had moments of not so comfortable. I've had moments where I had all that I needed more, and there were moments where I didn't have much of anything at all, if even my necessities were being met. And I tried to be content in whatever state I found myself in, Paul taught. Right? I can't judge for you, and you can't judge for me. What what is too comfortable. But I do know that when opportunity presents itself, and I've been offered an opportunity to help in a legitimate circumstance, that I need to step in and fill that void to the best of my ability. Here's what, now, I didn't know whether I was going to run down this path. Let's run down it for a minute. I would argue that this is harder today than it was when Jesus said it. And you say, well, what do you mean by that, Brian? Here's why. Who would they have known had need?
People back then were poor.
Okay, but how would they have known somebody had a need? They would have had to do what? Yeah, they'd had to be there. They had to be physically there, right? Or somebody had to come miles and miles away and bring them a letter and say, hey, they're poor Christians back there in Judea. They could really use your help. Paul then institutes the Lord's treasury out of that need. Says on the first day of the week, you're going to lay by and store so that there won't be any need for gatherings when I come. We've got to help these poor folks. But it took somebody coming to those other churches and telling them about what was going on. How quickly do you know about needs today? Now. Now. And not just needs of your neighbor, but the needs of people globally. Instantaneous knowledge of needs globally. That's harder, right? Because when it's just that very real kind of neighbor mindset, people that I have direct contact with, I know the situation. This man's been set at my gate day after day. I know he's poor. I know he has needs. I need to feed this fella. It's harder now because the truth is, if you and I helped every single circumstance that we ever encountered in our digital world, we'd have to turn around and be asking for help in return, right? Because there's always somebody. There is a continual need. And I don't know of any Bible text that illustrates to me that I have to bear the heavy guilt of that and the responsibility for the world, right? We have to use some discernment and judgment about when needs arise, how can I help in that need, and when's best to do those kinds of things. I think that's the challenge, right? To try to work through at times. And again, then that comes back to our own kind of judgment. And those are when the honesty tests have to come in. Am I laying up treasure in heaven? Is that where my focus is? Are my attentions upon what God desires for me? And to work through those kinds of questions and challenges we might have.
To me, realistically, I support our government, and our government supports the world.
Yeah. And I think there is some of that, Mike. I think there is a sense that we contribute in some ways as a whole, right, to aid and benefit. It doesn't remove all of our personal responsibilities, but it is part of, as citizens, of ways that we do contribute and help others.
He just said what I was about to say. Are we justified in ignoring those who need help when we know that they're going to receive this? You might be able to help out in the interim before they receive it, though. But I don't think government is an excuse for us to step back and say no.
Yeah.
Close our ears.
Yeah, I think you're right. We can respect the fact that we're part of that as citizens, but it doesn't eliminate some of the personal responsibilities that we might encounter along the way as well. Any other thoughts or questions you might have? I did make it to Acts 4. Won't make it much further, but I didn't make it to Acts 4. So what did the early Christians do with their earthly possessions there? And you see it in Acts 4, and particularly see it in verse 32. Yeah. So, and just real quick, historically here, why? Okay. And why were there more people in Jerusalem that needed help in this moment in time? Okay. Yeah. So they had come, remember, they come to the feast of Pentecost, many of them never intending or thinking about the fact that they're going to hear a completely different message than what they kind of thought they were coming to Pentecost for. They're converted, and now all of a sudden, normally they would have went home, but now they've stayed. And and until after the stoning of Stephen, right? You get to chapter 7 before they finally go, you know what? Maybe we should go home. And the disbursement comes, which actually led to more spread of the gospel after the stoning of Stephen, and those folks finally do begin to depart and go home, which is interesting because Stephen was one of the 7, that's right, he was one of the 7 men chosen to help make sure those Grecian widows in chapter 6 were taken care of based on these donations that were coming in from folks in chapter 4. Again, keep all contextual thought within Scripture and how those things mash together. And so he said, and the multitude of them that believed were of one heart and of one soul. Neither said any of them that aught of the things which he possessed was his own, but they had all things common. No one determined that his personal possessions were so rightfully his that he didn't need to be helpful in this circumstance. There was no selfishness among that early church. That's the imagery, right? There was no, this is mine and only mine, and I'm not sharing any of this with anyone. That mindset didn't belong in the early church. And you appreciate the fact that these folks were willing to even part with their personal properties, many of them selling land that they owned in order to provide what was necessary. Got Ananias and Sapphira in trouble, but men like Barnabas were doing it the right way. And it's really an amazing thing. And I think the imagery I was hoping we would gain from that is number one, everything comes from whom? It all comes from God. And when I'm sharing whatever I've been blessed with, that's where it really came from. I'm just simply sharing and distributing what God has blessed me with. And He's the real source of generosity that has brought that to me to begin with. So if I'll keep that mindset, that'll help. But I thought it was important for us to especially appreciate the fact that they have a specific focus. And who is it? Yeah, each other meaning the church, the Christians, the saints. There was a very specific focus. You see it in 1 Corinthians chapter 16. You see it in other narratives that he never said, don't ever help anybody else. But the Bible is very clear that there is a very, very specific responsibility that the family of the Lord takes care of each other. And you can see that in multiple texts within Scripture. And you see that concept introduced here in Acts chapter 4. When he speaks of this, notice he even defines the group, right? And the multitude of them that what? That believed. These are believers. Who is doing this in Acts chapter 4 and who is benefiting from it are the believers. Now again, not trying to argue that there might not have been some generosity among these folks towards others as well, but they understood a very specific responsibility to this new family that was being founded in Jesus, and to make sure that new family was being taken care of, and that everyone was being fairly treated, and the willingness to even go above and beyond and pick those 7 men in Acts chapter 6. And so it's a great lesson for us that number one, nothing that we really have really came from us, so why not be generous with it? And number two, let's in peculiar be very watchful of the needs of our brothers and sisters in Christ. Because if I've got to have a starting place, right? If I'm looking for a starting place of where generosity needs to begin, that's the starting place. And then you could also argue that and that's with others, there's also some biblical narrative that teaches us that we also need to do that where? With our physical families. The Bible's pretty clear. The man won't take care of his family. He's worse than an infidel, the Bible says. Pretty strong language. Pretty strong language that the Bible uses that relates to those things. And there's some other obligations that people need to appreciate. So there's some of that physical family responsibility that we have. And then when we begin to look outside of that realm, then we need to be looking at God's family. And then we also need to be looking at and hearing the cries and pleas of others that might come up as well in that process.
Gifting attitude's more important than the amounts you give.
Yeah. And that disposition, right? And that's really 2 Corinthians 9, right? What kind of giver? A cheerful giver, right? Cheerful giver. He's not worried about the various personal possessions he may or may not have. Very quickly, notice just some of these verses. But this I say, he which soweth sparingly shall reap what? Also sparingly. But he soweth bountifully shall reap also bountifully. Every man according as he purposeth in his heart, so let him give, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loveth a cheerful giver. Don't begrudge it. Don't just be cheerful. Don't give it just because you have to. But give it because God's asking, and it's the right thing, and it's a beneficial thing to be able to do that. God's given us grace that abounds. Remind ourselves of that when we're making those choices and decisions. And there's a whole lot more we could have talked about. I just didn't get to tonight in our study because I ran too far into Luke chapter 16, but that's my fault as it relates to that. Any other last minute thoughts or questions before we wrap up? Yeah, always let God get the glory, right? Always let Him be the focus, and we'll do the right things. If He's the focus, we'll do the right things. Yeah. It's a great example and reminder for us there as well. Any other thoughts before we close? Thank you all for your comments tonight. You can stop that stream for me, Tanner. Thank you.